In our previous Zelda theory, we discussed the possible future of the Gerudo province and its inhabitants following a return of their former leader, Ganondorf. So before we move on to new locations and subject matter, it seems only fitting that we linger for a bit longer in this sun-scorched landscape to investigate one of the more prominent and equally mysterious locations of the province, the 7, or should we say 8, heroine statues and their connection to the ancient history of the Gerudo people. There have been quite a lot of theories regarding these giants, and today we want to give our take on this puzzle. So put on your fedoras, grab your gear, as we're about to excavate the mystery of the 8 heroines.
Before we dive deeper into the mystery behind these statues, let's get some of the basic information across. Inside Gerudo town, Link will be able to meet a woman named Rotana, who is a scholar and archaeologist, who is investigating the case of the 7 heroines. She presents us with a vital clue, as well as a point on the map to follow. And upon visiting this location, we discover 7 gigantic statues facing each other in a circle, accompanied by 7 pedestals corresponding to each statue. Across the area, a set of 7 orbs lay around, and after doing some proper detective work and placing each one in the correct pedestal, a blessing shrine rises up from the sand. Mystery solved, right? Well, no, because as it turns out, there's more to these statues than we initially thought. Outside of the Gerudo town walls, we find a Hylian man who goes by the name of Bozai, and besides his affinity for sand jogging and female Link, this guy actually has something to add to the history of the 7 heroines. An 8th statue that is said to have been wiped from history is rumored to reside in the Gerudo Highlands. And when presented with photographic evidence, Bozai is actually surprised to know the reality, as according to him, he figured it was just stories and legends. And instead of informing the Gerudo about this discovery, Bozai suggests to keep it our little secret. As it stands, this is about as much information the game presents us with directly, and not even the Gerudo themselves seem to know much about this part of their own ancient history, as Rotana clearly points out that all the statues seem the same to her, meaning even they don't seem to know who the statues are supposed to represent. However, that did not stop fans from scrutinizing the evidence further, so let's go over the more in-depth aspects of these statues.
Let's kick things off with the original 7 heroines. For starters, there is actual Gerudo scripture on both the statues and the pedestals. The pedestals themselves are not that interesting, as the text simply repeat the word pedestal in a circle. However, the text on the statues themselves reads, the 7 sages. This has sparked a great deal of debate within the Zelda community as to who these statues are supposed to represent. And before we try to look for the answer, let's look at some of the details on how these statues were built in the first place. If we can learn anything from ancient stoneworks in real life, it's that in most cases across our own history, the same methods were used for creating monuments of this size. Instead of carving out a giant block of stone and hauling it to its final destination, it was much more effective to carve the statue right into the quarry itself. This way, if for any reason the statue was compromised halfway through the process, at least the workers saved themselves the trouble of transporting a multi-ton piece of rock for no good reason. A good example of this is the Egyptian obelisk, which was abandoned halfway through because of a massive crack that had developed, rendering it useless. Many other cultures use this method as well. Workers would line up and carve their way in and around the statue, chipping away at the rock using pounding stones made from a rock type that was harder than the stone they were working on. Eventually, all sides would meet at the back, and that's when the statue was snapped off and ready to be transported to its final resting place. Looking at the statues, we can immediately see that the backside has no detail or features, it's just a flat surface. This would suggest that they were also stuck to a mountainside at one point. Something that is also interesting to note is that the sword and the statue appear to be 2 separate entities, 2 different projects that, upon completion, were combined. Mounting the swords into the hand of the statue, we can actually see the evidence for this as the statue's sword has collapsed, yet the hands remain intact, showing no signs of damage.
Which brings us to the 8th statue. There seems to be some confusion as to why the statue stands against the mountain in this remote location. Some suggest that there might be a dungeon behind it, and while that could still be a possibility, especially now that we're getting a sequel, Breath of the Wild 2, it is more likely that the statue was simply never completed. As stated before, it is much more effective to carve a statue of this size right into the mountain, so it can be extracted after completion, which could explain why it's still stuck to this wall. Whoever built it might have been interrupted or simply chose to leave the statue as it is, no longer feeling the need to transport it. But what about the sword, which is missing from the statue itself? As we pointed out, it is most likely that the sword and statue were separate objects and projects being worked on by different groups. The only difference here is that the sword, unlike the statue, seems to stand free from its surroundings. It is not stuck to the mountain itself, which might indicate that transportation of the sword had already started. It is to be expected that if being worked on at the same time, the sword would finish first, as it is smaller and has a more simple base form. The sword and statue were supposed to meet up at some point, but unknown events prevented this from ever coming to fruition, which begs the question, what caused this project to be abandoned in the first place? Who built it? When was it built? And for what purpose?
Breath of the Wild's past can be divided into 7 sections. The distant past, which marks the time when Ganon still assumed his Gerudo form under the name Ganondorf. This is also when he first transformed into the beast known as Ganon and trying to take over Hyrule. More than 10,000 years ago, which is probably the most abstract of the 7, all we know is that during this time, Hyrule enjoyed a technological golden age thanks to the technological achievements made by the Sheikah, and that around this time, the Zora first settled in Lanayru. 10,000 years ago, which is when the Calamity was successfully halted by the combined strength of ancient Sheikah's technology and the hero and the princess of that era. Just before 100 years ago, when the Kingdom of Hyrule started preparations for the return of the Calamity based on the prophecy, 100 years ago, the day of the most recent Calamity which almost wiped out Hyrule. After the Great Calamity, where the remaining survivors are in hiding, awaiting the return of the hero, and the present, which is where the events of Breath of the Wild take place, ending with the defeat of Calamity Ganon. The distant past is a tricky one, as it is unknown how long ago exactly this took place. It could be 20,000 years ago, 50,000, or even more. What we do know is this, that during this time there was also an awakening of a number of sages who fought alongside the hero and the princess and aided in sealing away Ganon for the first time. 2 of which have been confirmed to be Princess Ruto and the other one being Neighboru. The more than 10,000 years ago marker could fall anywhere between the distant past and 10,000 years ago, but it is most likely that it falls closer to 10,000 years ago than the distant past, seeing as Hyrule started its technological golden age around this point and carried this through all the way up until the royal family decided to banish it after the Calamity. Also, pretty much no other significant events took place around this time. So at which point in time were the statues built? Looking at the evidence, somewhere between 10,000 and more than 10,000 years ago. The biggest reason being that this is the only period in time where there are no records of significant events in the Gerudo timeline. After the events of the distant past and the many subsequent revivals and resealings of Ganon, it is most likely that during this period, the Gerudo kept to themselves, feeling shame and frustration that one of their own could have created so much destruction and hatred across Hyrule. They proceeded to rebuild their lands and place statues honoring those that played crucial roles in the wars against Ganon. Remember that by this point, Ganon has already become Calamity Ganon, meaning that this was after he was sealed for the last time. A seal that has endured all the way up until the present. Well, until the events of the sequel that is, because remember that Calamity Ganon is not Ganon, but rather a manifestation of his hatred for the Kingdom of Hyrule. Ganondorf himself at this point has been sealed for so long in fact that he has given up on reincarnation, as stated by Zelda right before the final showdown with Dark Beast Ganon.
Ganon was born out of a dark past. He is a pure embodiment of the ancient evil that is reborn time and time again. He has given up on reincarnation and assumed his pure, enraged form. If set free upon our world, the destruction will be unlike anything ever seen before.
Being trapped for so long, Ganondorf's existence slowly faded away from history. Every race of people in Breath of the Wild's Hyrule, including the wise Sheikah, strictly used the name Calamity Ganon, meaning that in their history and culture, the true form and origin of the Calamity has been long forgotten, except for one, the Gerudo. It is clear from Urbosa's speech after reclaiming control of Varnaboris that the stories of Ganondorf have always been kept within the walls of Gerudo town. And out of all races, the Gerudo are the most determined when it comes to fighting Calamity Ganon, with Urbosa accepting Zelda's request without any hesitation, being a clear testament of this commitment. Meaning that even after all these countless of years, they still feel an obligation to take responsibility to deal with the consequences of the ancient past. So that takes care of when and who built the original 7 statues. That leaves us with 2 remaining questions. Who are these statues supposed to represent? And what is the story behind the 8th statue? According to Creating a Champion, the Gerudo have a very distinct culture and customs from the rest of Hyrule. Instead of worshipping the statue of the goddess Hylia, which is the most dominant deity seen across the rest of Hyrule, the Gerudo worship the 7 heroines, the statue of goddess Hylia remaining forgotten in a back alley. 2 of the 7 sages from the distant past, Naburu and Ruto, match up exactly according to their race and gender. So we can only assume that the other 5 are the very same sages from Ocarina of Time. So if these statues were originally meant to represent the original 7 sages from the distant past, then why are they all female? Simple. Unlike the Gorons who accurately depict their leaders from the past in all its detail, the Gerudo do not personify the monuments. They have a tendency to leave their statues nameless, and we can see this trend all across both the modern and ancient culture. We can find a number of different statues attributed to people who are obviously of great significance at some point in history. The pose that the heroines strike is obviously attributed to a kind of protector or guardian. We can find 4 additional statues inside Gerudo town itself, all in the same pose and without names. And even Bulyara, who is Riju's personal protector, strikes the same pose as the statues do. Evidence shows that no matter what gender or role a person has played in the past, they are depicted in the same way, leaving out any personal features. The sages were without a doubt protectors of Hyrule, and when the time came to confront evil, the sages acted as a crucial part in disposing of the said evil using their powers to seal it away. Although the statues were probably built tens of thousands of years ago to pay tribute to the original 7 sages, the Sheikah later revisited the site and modified it to create a trial to test the hero, meaning that the site has been likely altered to fit this purpose. This leads us to believe that both the pedestals and the orbs have been added later by the Sheikah, which could explain why the 7 virtues attributed to each statue don't seem to match with any of Ocarina of Time's sages. This wouldn't be the first time that the Sheikah used and altered ruins from other cultures.
Which brings us finally to the final piece of the puzzle, the 8th heroine. If this monument was built by the Gerudo themselves, then why do some of its features differ so greatly from the other 7? The other statues were built from yellow sandstone, while the 8th is made from this brown reddish looking rock type, granting it the name, the Bronze Giant. If placed among the others, it would most likely stand out as an abnormality, so the only conclusion is that it was made by someone else. The most likely candidate being, of course, the Yiga clan. In the description of the 8th heroine side quest, it states that, although wiped from history, it is still to this day worshipped by her faithful in the Gerudo Highlands. Who resides in the Gerudo Highlands? That's right, the Yiga clan. While this doesn't necessarily confirm that the Yiga actually built the statue, it most certainly means that the Yiga know who the statue is supposed to represent. Their faithfulness to Calamity Ganon shows they will do anything to mock or reject any of the morals and values present in Hyrule. Perhaps they did build the statue to insult the Gerudo people. One of the big other differences we can see from the statue is that it is a mirrored version of the original 7. And since the Yiga have a tendency to, well, flip things around, it might not be too far-fetched that their ancestors from 10,000 years ago created this statue to honor what they see as their hero and savior, Calamity Ganon. Lastly, the Yiga clan's hideout houses a total of 8 statues as opposed to 7, and it is confirmed by Creating a Champion that prior to being occupied by the Yiga, this used to be an ancient Gerudo archaeological site, meaning that even the Gerudo might have been aware of the potential 8th sage. Then again, since the scriptures on these statues doesn't insinuate anything related to the 7 stages, the Yiga might have just taken inspiration from it and decided to create an 8th statue devoted to Ganon.
The statues of the heroines will remain a mystery for now, but there's hope that Breath of the Wild sequel will shed some light on it and give us a definitive answer. After all, in the 2017 Nintendo Switch presentation trailer of Breath of the Wild, Nintendo made sure to include a shot of this mysterious location. This could be an indication that they have more things planned for it. By far the most difficult thing about this theory is that we don't know for sure when these statues were even built. It could be 10,000 years ago or even 50,000 years ago or more. What we do know is that the calamity is a cycle that has been plaguing the people of Hyrule for long enough, that they were able to notice this pattern and predict when the next one would take place, through prophecy, legends and stories. Will the 8th statue house a new dungeon? Maybe. But until we get more answers, this is one of those mysteries that thrives off of our own imaginations. Perhaps we will see a return of the sages, or a new incarnation of them, as they were completely absent from Breath of the Wild. And we can't wait to find out more with upcoming trailers of the game. So until then, join us next week for a special Halloween episode where we'll explore the fear factor of the Zelda series and why we love it so much. So be sure to leave a like, subscribe and press that shiny notification bell to not miss any of our future episodes. And while you're at it, why not visit us on Patreon to support our future projects? You can follow the link in the description to visit the website at patreon.com/commonrun. Until then, this was Conrad, Leo and Donnie, and we will see you in the next one.